Alright, so as you guys know, The Batman is releasing on March 4th, so now is the perfect time to start getting some Batman reviews out there. I'm gonna save the Tim Burton, Michael Keaton ones closer to when The Flash is coming out. So starting out each week, we're gonna look at an installment in the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy, starting with the film that kicked off this trilogy back in 2005, Batman Begins. Stupid. Alright, so in Batman Begins, you got Bruce Wayne, played by Christian Bale, the famous billionaire of Gotham, whom after his parents have been brutally murdered, has been traveling the world living life as a criminal as he trains with the League of Shadows to learn ninjutsu to return back to Gotham to fight the crime as the Batman. Alright, so as mentioned before with Batman Begins, it was released in 2005, and for that reason, I saw Batman Begins a little later in life. I grew up watching the Batman animated series. I watched the Michael Keaton films that Tim Burton made back in the 90s, as well as Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, which were later taken over by Joel Schumacher. Those were my real introductions to Batman. I did not see Batman Begins until I was about in middle school, and at that time, I wasn't a big Batman guy. He wasn't my favorite superhero, and it was around the time where he seemed to be everyone's favorite superhero. You ask someone in my middle school who their favorite superhero was, 9 times out of 10 they were going to say Batman. And that was almost exclusively because of Batman Begins and The Dark Knight. So I watched Batman Begins in middle school, trying to catch up with the cool kids, and I thought it was okay. I thought it was overrated when I first watched it, to be honest. But I recently just sat down and watched it again for the first time in a couple of years, and the first thing that I will say that sticks out to me about Batman Begins is this is the first Batman movie that focuses on Batman. Which is kind of weird to say after having like 4 Batman films in the 90s, but those movies always focused more on the villains. Those movies always had the villain overshadowing Batman, whether it was the Joker, Penguin, Catwoman, the Riddler, Two-Face, Mr. Freeze, Poison Ivy even. Batman Begins is kind of the first movie that fully centers around the character of Bruce Wayne, and he doesn't get overshadowed by any of the villains in this movie. And talk about Bruce Wayne, let's talk about Christian Bale's performance in this movie. Christian Bale as Bruce Wayne does a really good job of separating Batman from the Bruce Wayne persona. Christian Bale pulls out 3 performances in this movie alone. When he's with Alfred and he's being Bruce Wayne, the authentic Bruce Wayne, he pulls that off great. When he's in public and he has to pull off the playboy billionaire Bruce Wayne that he puts a face on for the public to see so that they don't suspect him as Batman, he does a great job of convincingly pulling that off too. And of course, when he's Batman, Christian Bale looks great in the suit. He can pull off all the action sequences, and let's talk about that voice for a minute. Because we all know the Christian Bale Batman voice. It's been mocked and parodied and talked about in pop culture since pretty much it was introduced in this movie.
Where were the other drugs going?
But what I will say about Christian Bale's Batman voice in this movie is, watching it back again, I don't really feel like Christian Bale overdoes it with the voice. It works very well with his character to keep people from guessing who he is. It's gravelly, it's rough, but you can understand what he's saying, and when he disguises his voice, which is something a lot of superheroes don't do, let's put credit where credit is due. A lot of superheroes in a lot of superhero films, they don't disguise their voice even when they're talking to people that they're close to. But Christian Bale's Batman is kind of the first one that I can think of that's done that. And yeah, it can be a little goofy, it can be a little silly, it's fun to mock, but in this movie, I gotta admit that it works. And I gotta give Christian Bale credit for pulling it off throughout this whole movie, because I've only done it a couple times during this review, and my throat's already getting there, guys. It's starting to hurt. I also love the way that Christopher Nolan tells the story in Batman Begins. It's broken up into flashbacks cutting between present time and telling the origin story of Bruce. Because if you had told this movie in a linear fashion, I do feel like it would have dragged and taken too long to get to the Batman stuff and get to his training with the League of Shadows. But by having the present time and the flashbacks cut up within each other, I just think that it helps this movie's pacing out tremendously, because by the time that we get to the Batman stuff, you understand who Bruce Wayne is, you understand why he's doing what he's doing, and how he's able to do it. That's one of the things that this movie does that none of the other Batman movies do. When Bruce Wayne is being trained by the League of Shadows and getting mentored by Liam Neeson, they explain and they show the techniques that he's learning, how he's growing to be a ninja, where a lot of his tools come from, where his morals come from. That scene where Bruce Wayne is told to kill the criminal and he tells him that he won't cross that line, he will not become an executioner, setting up the line that Batman has where he doesn't kill people, was just brilliant. Another really cool thing about Batman Begins is how minimal the villains play in this movie, because we do have Scarecrow played by Cillian Murphy, but realistically he's only really in a couple of scenes, and I do kind of wish that we could get a little bit more of Scarecrow in this movie, because when he releases that gas into people's face to make them see their greatest fear, there's some really creepy, awesome imagery that comes from that. Like in the end sequence when the whole city's being gassed, I wish that we got to see more people's perspective of the fears that they were seeing. I wish that they would have dove into that a little bit more. But as it is, this is just a really unique Batman movie of all the other Batman movies that we had up until this point, because Batman's just going street level, and he's just taking down the lowest of scum of Gotham City. He's single-handedly trying to clean up the city that his father was investing a lot of time in to try to help clean up. In a way, Batman is Bruce Wayne's way to carry on his father's legacy. Batman Begins does have some shortcomings though, mainly with the relationship between Bruce Wayne and Rachel, played by Katie Holmes. Katie Holmes just feels really miscast to me in this role. She's the one person in this movie where you can feel her performance feels a little bit lesser than the rest of the people in this movie. But when you've got Gary Oldman, Christian Bale, Liam Neeson, even Morgan Freeman in there as Lucius, the one who applies all of the gadgets and wonderful toys to Bruce Wayne as Batman, which is another great thing that this movie did, because Batman just being a rich billionaire doesn't really explain how he gets all of the gadgets that he gets. So the way that they explain that all of this is basically prototype work that Lucius is working on in Wayne Tower that he then gives to Bruce Wayne and he uses as Batman was just a perfect explanation. It was so well done. But out of these thespians of actors, Katie Holmes does stick out to me. She didn't give a terrible performance, she just stuck out among the rest. And going back to the villains a little bit, I do feel like the villains are a little weak in this movie. There are some conveniences in this movie that do make me go, well, that's a little bit too much of happenstance. Like, for example, Bruce Wayne training with a guy who just so happens to want to destroy Gotham, a city where he's from, that he's going to return to as Batman, so that they can fight in the final third act. I don't know, it doesn't 100% work for me, but I can overlook it and I can get behind it. But guys, in the end, Batman Begins is really a great movie. It took a little while for me to get on that bandwagon, but now that I can get past my feelings of overratedness that I felt in middle school, this was by far the best Batman movie that had been made up until this point. It got Batman right, it got Bruce Wayne right, it explained things in a realistic, grounded way. You totally believe that this Batman could exist in this world. That's another thing about Gotham in this movie. I love how grounded in reality it is. Because in the 90s Batman movies, they were always over the top, kind of cartoony. You never really believed it to be a real city in the real world. But the Gotham in this movie is designed and totally feels like it could take place in our reality. The performances are great, the characters are great. It's honestly one of the best origin stories I think that has been put to film in a superhero film. It's totally true, it changed the game for superhero films. You can feel it when you watch this movie. But you guys all know this. It's a classic amongst the superhero genre. It's a classic just in films in general. It deserves the mark that it has in pop culture. Batman Begins is definitely a recommend. But what do you guys think of Batman Begins? Are you a big Batman fan or are you more casual like I am? Comment down below, let me know. I want to know all your thoughts and opinions about this movie. As always, guys, thank you so much for clicking on this video and checking out my channel. Join me again next week. We'll be talking about The Dark Knight. Have you heard of it? So look forward to that. And if you like talking all things movies, TV, and all things entertainment, why don't you go on and click that subscribe button, click that like button, click that notification bell, all that YouTube stuff. And I hope to talk to you guys again real soon.